So we flip back over to the desktop, and we're going to really show two things here, Jeff, if you remember from the slide deck. We're going to show how easy it is to create a .NET Core solution. In fact, we're going to do it from a command prompt. It's going to be really quick. And I know there's going to be some developers that are watching this and say, yeah, I know how to do this. But I'm telling you, a large percentage of us being developers out there, actually don't know how easy this is. So I'm just going to demonstrate that. The other thing I want to show is how there are no dependencies in this unless we want it to be. And then we're going to flip over to Visual Studio 2017, and we've got a solution that we sort of shelled out for these sessions, ASP.NET Core solution. And we're going to go in, we're going to, first of all, dig around in a little bit, make sure we feel comfortable with what's there, and then add a little bit of code to that. And we're going to talk about some tips and tricks for ASP.NET Core solutions in the 2017 world. So let's just open up a command prompt. And I'm just going to type in, if you're old school and you know what this means, this is MD is make directory, and I'm just going to create a directory called Hello World. But I'm going to spell it correctly. There we go, Hello World. So I've made a directory. I'm going to say CD Hello World. So I'm in that directory. That's change directory, Hello World. And now I'm going to say .NET New. And I could just say .NET New and it would spin up a new .NET Core application. So I'm going to do something that's a little bit trickier. I'm going to give it a template and I'm going to say web. So what this is going to do is just going to create a new .NET web application. So we're going to create that. It takes, half a millisecond, create a new C# project called Hello World. And then I'm going to type in code dot, and this is going to tell Visual Studio Code to open it up at this folder structure. So I'll say code dot, and we'll notice when that opens up, we'll see that we've got this solution that's been created. We'll see that if it's got this default home controller that's been created. And if we take a look at this program.cs, this looks almost exactly like what we had in the slide. The only thing that's been added here, since I decided to create this as an ASP.NET web application, is we've added IIS integration. And the reason I'm pointing this out is because there's developers that say, oh, I want this available on Mac and Linux, and this is IIS integration, and that doesn't exist. This will not affect your portability in any way if you have this here. So if you use IIS integration, this is going to help with you debugging on localhost and to do some things locally. Really, it's almost like using IIS Express here. So you don't need to worry about that. So this is all that's happening here. So if I were to then say in the integrated terminal, .NET restore, this is going to make sure that any NuGet packages or dependencies are restored. I could say .NET build. I don't even have to say that, but this is going to build it. Going to get some output. And then here's the important thing that I want to show. If we say .NET run, so this is going to run this application. So if I say .NET run, people are going to say, well, where is it? I don't see it running. This seems ridiculous, but this happened. So the first time I got into this, and a bunch of my peers got into this whole .NET Core and VS Code scenario, they said, well, where's all the GUI, right? You don't have all this tooling. Is anything really happening? Well, if you notice down at the bottom, it says now listening on localhost 5000. So if we were to just open up localhost 5000, look at that. So we've got this ASP.NET Core application that's out there running. So the point of showing this is to show how quick and easy that is. If all you've got is a command prompt, all you want is a command prompt, all you have to do is spin it up that way. So let's close that down and go actually into Visual Studio 2017. So this is a...
And by the way, I mean, Visual Studio Code is cross-plat itself. So you could just as easily be doing this demo on a Mac or on a Linux laptop as on Windows.
So this is a super good point. Every aspect of what I just demonstrated would work if you were on a Mac.
Including
today.
the IDE.
Including the IDE.
Yeah.
In fact, the only difference there is that some of the font styles are going to look slightly different because of a Mac, but everything is going to be the same. So what we've created for this session is this app this ASP.NET app that I've called Tagger. Now the whole purpose of this as we go through these sessions is that we're going to be integrating all of these cool Azure functions, Azure services, cognitive services, Luis. We're going to be using all of this features and functionality of SQL Server 2016. A whole bunch of pieces together. We're going to put this in the solution that I'm calling Tagger. And what Tagger is going to do is let people upload photos. Those photos will get captioned, tagged, marked, processed. They'll be stuck into storage. They'll be maybe put into object storage, for example, and going to let people tag all of their own photos. So not just captioned, but tagging their photos. And then at the end of the process, they can save these. And this is actually something that I think is pretty cool, that a lot of folks don't realize how easy it is using cognitive services. So imagine that you have, 100,000 photos on your computer. Well, what if you just want photos of the beach, or you just want photos of the grass, or you want photos that have a certain person in them? Well, right now it's very difficult to do that. So using cognitive services, you could have these automatically tagged, and you could just type into OneDrive, or you could type in on your computer, search grass, or search boat, and all of these photos would be tagged for you. So I thought it'd be cool if we let people use this and walk through a solution how they could create that themselves. So we've got this ASP.NET Core solution here, and a couple things I want to look at right away. So if you're using Visual Studio 2017 RC, if you right-click over the project and say Edit the Project, I want you to pay attention to this line here. Package Target Fallback. If you create a new .NET Core, ASP.NET Core solution today, it's going to look a little bit different. And you may have problems bringing in some NuGet packages. Some of those packages, for example, are Application Insights. If right now you're working with Visual Studio 2017 RC and you can't bring in some NuGet packages, here's your tip. Add a fallback for .NET 5.6. Now this is still going to port without a problem. It's something that is going to be resolved in the release version of 2017, but in this RC, some of these packages will choke. Another one that will choke is JSON.NET. Now almost everybody uses JSON.NET, the Newtonsoft stuff all the time. So pay attention to that. We'll call that out again, but you might want to add that. Also, if you don't have a target framework that's evaluated against .NET Core App 1.0 or higher, you may want to add that in there. Okay, so this is going to give you the ability to bring in NuGet packages and have them be able to be ported.
Excellent. And just to be 100% clear about this, Scott, you are running the public RC version of Visual Studio 2017 at the moment.
Yes, correct. There
will be undoubtedly some changes, some improvements once the product RTMs later on.
Yes, correct. So this is running RC1 of Visual Studio 2017. And so again, this is an issue that may not be there in the release version. In fact, my guess is that it won't be there in the release version. But just to avoid some frustration if you're using RC right now, go ahead and do that right away. But other than that, when we go in and look at this code, if you're an MVC developer, this will look very familiar to you right off the bat. We've got our www root, we've got controllers, we've got our models, we've got views. It's going to look almost entirely the same. What I want to focus on, though, is just going into this program.cs file, taking a look at how that looks exactly how it looked when we were in VS Code, and then taking a look at the startup. I want to talk about a couple of these pieces in here and add a little bit of code. So this should look very familiar. Now, some of these methods and some of the overloads for these methods have changed with ASP.NET Core in this version in 1.01 and higher. But most developers, if they're familiar with MVC development, modern MVC development, will recognize much of this. What I want to focus on is two pieces here that we referred to earlier as middleware. And I just want to make this clarification here. When a .NET Core app is created out of the box with no dependencies, it'll look just like this. In fact, you won't even have configure services here. What we're telling the solution, what we're telling the web server, the web host builder, is we want to add MVC support, and we want to add the ability to add some options when we're doing this. We also have these two lines of code here that should look familiar to you. We're saying we want to add the ability to have static files, use static files. A static file would be if I have an index.html. or something like that. And then we're saying use MVC and pass it around. So this should be very familiar for folks that are doing MVC development already on 4.6 versions like that. So this should be very familiar to you right off the bat. So the other thing I wanted to look at, Jeff, was this idea of consolidated dependencies. If we expand this dependencies node, notice how we have Bower and NuGet here. And this is really for developers who are out there that have been web form developers or have been using some of the older legacy technologies. They're thinking, why do I need to manage multiple types of dependencies? So there's all kinds of different ways that we could manage things. NuGet packages, for example, developers are getting very familiar with, will manage server-side dependencies. But a lot of client-side dependencies now get messy. So let's say you're using Bootstrap, or maybe you're using jQuery, or maybe you're using some of these other things. The way that it was done without Bower or some of these other dependency managers were that you just brought in a reference, you put a reference in code, and you just wanted to make sure you had the latest version. Well, now in Visual Studio, you just manage these just like NuGet packages. So if I were to right-click over to Bower, I could say Manage Bower Packages. See, this is really cool. So especially if you're coming from the .NET world and you've been used to managing NuGet package, you do the same thing here, and you can actually just browse for things, search for packages that are available. You can check what's installed. You can see what things are updated. So you'll notice in this solution, I'm using Bootstrap, which I love, jQuery. I've got a drop zone. This is a drop zone, the client-side drop zone that will give us the ability for users to drag images just right onto a web page, and then it'll process them instead of having them click File, Upload with the old-fashioned thing like that. So it's a real easy way to manage these. And then we also have NuGet dependencies that are here too. So if I say Manage NuGet Packages, we see that that's being handled that same way. So the concept here is that any kind of dependencies now are going to be managed simply through this dependency node. And this is really helpful.
And all of these NuGet packages in the solution here target .NET Core, correct?
Yep, and this is a really important thing to continue to clarify. If you bring in a NuGet package that's targeted to .NET Core, if it compiles, it's going to work on Linux. It's going to work in a Mac. In fact, it'll tell you right away, and you might be fooled for about a half a millisecond. You'll say, bring in support for Azure Document DB, for example, which is not fully supported for the NuGet package. It'll come in, it'll say it's going to start bringing it in, but it'll immediately say that this is not available for this targeted platform.
That's good. So you're not going to get any nasty surprises. You're going to be told that, hey, you can do this if you want to, but just be aware of the consequences.
Yeah, exactly. So the scenario where it's working on your machine, but then doesn't work when you deploy it to Linux, for example, is not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And then I wanted to point out, since again this project.json has gone away, I just want to make reference to that in here for you folks that are wondering what that looks like. If I scroll down in my project file now, a bunch of this should look familiar to you. Now, instead of having the JSON markup data, now we have it in XML, but we have here Microsoft Application Insights.ASP.NET Core. So we have all those dependencies in there. So Jeff, you'll remember in the slide deck we talked about an ASP.NET Core solution simply being a console app that's getting loaded up with a web server that's sort of listening like that. To demonstrate this, let's take a look at the launch settings that gets created in the ASP.NET Core template and just take a look at these two profiles that we have. So we have this IIS Express profile. This is how most web developers with Visual Studio are used to testing, debugging, and running their solutions. IIS Express or IIS through that profile. But we also have this second profile with the command name project. This is actually going to give us the ability to watch what's happening as that web server gets sort of spun up, as that console app is running. And you'll notice that this is actually loading on a different port. Notice how this is loading on 12.779 in this example, and our IIS settings are set to 12.778. So we can take a look at that by running it with the different profile here. We're going to do that in a second. But before we do that, let's go ahead and go into this startup and add a little bit of middleware. Now remember, we're going to be building this solution over the course of time. One of the things that most developers want right away, as you mentioned earlier, is data. We're going to want data in our solution. Well, out of the box, or the template, when it gets created for .NET Core, is going to keep almost all the dependencies, or all the dependencies, absent from your solution unless you want to add them in. I have MVC support in this solution because I know we're going to want that. But let's say that you want to have DB context, database context. Maybe you want to call Azure SQL, or you want to call SQL Server 2016, or even later on SQL Server for Linux. We just add that in as a service. So let's just add that code in there. Take a look at that real quick. Two things I'm doing here to talk to storage. Number one, I'm getting some storage account settings. So storage account settings will always pull from your appsettings.json. This is still the same. This has not gone away like Project JSON. So for example, if I were to look over at appsettings.json, you'll see that I've got some information about a storage account we'll use later on. I've got some connection strings to some databases. I've got some application insights keys that we're going to add in and talk about later. But this is how we're going to manage the data related to app settings. But for an actual database, or to talk to storage, we're going to use this database context, or excuse me, this DB context. And it's going to be a simple process. We're going to grab a connection string. So I'm actually taking that connection string from my app JSON settings. I'm adding some credentials to it. And then I'm going to just spin up a new add DB context. So I was able to add this support in just by overriding the configure services. So in configure services, I am able to say services.addDB context. And then here's a cool thing that was fun to get used to. This idea, it's almost taking this whole code first concept with Entity Framework and with database creation, where I'm kind of describing what that data looks like on the client. And then I could push this out and could create the data structure for me, or I could just reference it that way. This whole idea that I have to have these messy mappings goes away. So I've just got this tags context that I can build in code. So if we were to just go take a look at that real quick, you'll see that I've just got these DB sets that kind of in this instance map back to tables. So I've got these three different tables that are attached to this tags context. And then I'm saying use SQL Server. And now there's a bunch of different options I can give this, but I'm using SQL Server. And so again, in this scenario, I can use SQL Server because I'm talking to Azure SQL, and I'm going to be talking to SQL Server 2016, and then later on SQL Server for Linux. I don't have to change any code. In fact, the cool thing that we're going to show in a little bit is that all I have to do is change the connection string, because the connection string obviously to my Linux server is going to be different than SQL Server. So if we have this in place, this is going to spin up a DB context. It's going to say that you want MVC support, and then it's going to run the app. Let's take a look at that, though, in the console first and see how that looks. So we'll load up Tagger here. Loads that console app. And then you notice that the app is loading up. So here we go, and this is an ASP.NET Core app. And this entire solution is built using ASP.NET Core. It's using Bower to manage the client-side dependencies like Bootstrap, and then it's using NuGet packages to manage things like application insights, Azure storage, anything related to SQL Server dependencies. For example, Entity Framework for .NET Core. And this is an important note, there is a specific package for Entity Framework for .NET Core. In fact, for a number of these, there's a separate package for .NET Core. You might want to get used to this. So if you've got an ASP.NET solution right now and you have this idea that maybe you want to just sort of backport it to .NET Core, there's going to be some changes that you have to make there. Okay? Great. So this is all spun up and this is all ready, and we haven't had to do a bunch of work here. Why don't we go back over to the slide deck now and talk about adding application insights to this?